So I'm going to tell you about a few things, but I just want to clear up generally what's been going on so far with the story. So the whole book starts 1954, there you go, to 1975, and that year, 1954, is significant because very little had happened with regards to African American civil rights. Until 1954, where you get the massive Brown versus Topeka case, or however you pronounce it, in 1954, which is the Supreme Court, for the first time really, ruling that what was going on in the South was not really constitutional. It wasn't going along with the terms of the Constitution, which had been amended as a result of the Civil War. It wasn't lawful, in other words, to do separate but equal, because quite clearly what was going on was separate but unequal. And the ball started rolling from there. And as soon as people realised that the Supreme Court, the biggest court, the most important court that decides what is and isn't against the law, had got on the African American side with Brown versus Topeka, it gave people an idea that maybe the time for change was then. And things started to roll on. So civil rights. If you think, what are your rights, and you are a civilian, that's the best way to think of civil rights. So the African Americans, for example, believed it was their civil right to be able to vote, to have a fair education, the same as everybody else, and just everything which is your right as a United States citizen at any time that you live in the United States and are a United States citizen. So it shouldn't be different for white and black people, because that means it's violating your civil right just because of the colour of your skin. And when the slaves were freed in the 1860s, there were 3 amendments to the US Constitution. And the US Constitution is sort of the list of rules they wrote out when America became a country. And they changed them to make it very clear that people should not be discriminated against because of the colour of their skin. And this is what the civil rights movement was trying to achieve, the things which were written there in the Constitution, which should really have been theirs anyway. Anyway, James Meredith case. Well, it's a bit like the Little Rock High incident, but at university, and only one person, James Meredith, who wanted to go to university. Unfortunately, at Mississippi University, they weren't willing to accept him. However, the Supreme Court, as they seemed to be doing after 1954, upheld a decision to force Mississippi University to accept him. They said, you can't not accept him, you've got to accept him, he's qualified. Now this is where it gets ridiculous. The president had to intervene because the university tried to stop Meredith from being able to register, and the president sent 320 federal marshals, which I think you could probably think of a bit like police officers, a bit like state police officers, to escort James Meredith to the campus. 320 people who had a wage paid to make sure one person could go to university. And the white people fought back, and there were riots. 2 people were killed. In the riots, of the 320 marshals that were sent, 166 of them were wounded, and 210 demonstrators were wounded. And so, James Meredith going to university, which led to 320 federal marshals, ended with President Kennedy having to send more than 2,000 troops to restore order. And the civil rights movement called this whole thing the Battle of Oxford. Not really sure why they called it the Battle of Oxford. Bit strange to me. Maybe Google will tell us. Bonus points if you can find out. And then so for the rest of the time that James Meredith stayed at university, there were 300 soldiers on campus making sure that this one person could go to university. And just like every other incident just about that we've learned about so far, the black people ask for something which is fairly reasonable. White racists fight back, use violence, and the result is increased support for the civil rights movement. In this case, the Supreme Court and the President had to intervene, and a heck of a lot of other people besides to make sure this one person could go to university. Now, there was other examples of this happening, but the fact that the President and the Supreme Court got involved to make this happen, I think that's the key thing that we need to know. Now, there's something which goes a little bit against the grain today, which is the Albany movement, 1961 to 62. By the way, Meredith happened in 1962. So it's linked to the Freedom Rides, or the Freedom Riders, who were going through Albany in the state of Georgia, and they were arrested. And as a result of this, a number of black civil rights groups got together and created what became known as the Albany movement to try to make sure Albany, the town of Albany in Georgia, was desegregated, so there would be no more separation of white and black things. And loads of people joined in, and even Martin Luther went to visit, and there was a march, and Martin Luther, who's by now the key leader of the civil rights movement and very famous, he was arrested, and he was kept in prison for a while because he refused to pay a fine. He could have paid the fine and left, but he said, I'm not paying a fine, I didn't do anything wrong. And through his principles, he stuck to them, so he had to stay in prison for a little while. Whilst he was in prison, he supposedly wrote a very important letter, which you may find out about. But how did the white people react to this Albany movement? Well, just a bit like Little Rock High School, if you remember that, where they shut the school. Well, in this case, Albany's parks, swimming pools were completely shut, and schools continued to be segregated despite all of this, and despite the Brown versus Topeka case and Little Rock all showing that they shouldn't. It basically didn't change anything. So the Albany movement is quite significant here because it's an example of civil rights activists trying to change something over those 2 years, and it didn't really happen. There was a teeny success. There were an increase in black voters in the area, but largely not much changed in Albany in those 2 years. So it was a rare failure, really, of the civil rights movement. Now then, the voter education project is the last key thing that you need to make sure you get on your sheet. And basically, the Freedom Riders caused the Kennedys, who were in power at the time, to try to do something to make sure there were less of these violent confrontations, because it was just embarrassing for the American government when they were trying to portray themselves as the country of freedom in the world and the morally superior country, that this white racist violence was happening against the black people who wanted nothing more than, say, for example, to be able to sit somewhere on a bus or go to school. And so what Robert Kennedy set up was the Voter Education Project. The idea was to educate people, educate African Americans, to make sure they registered to vote and to overcome any barriers that were put in front of them. And there were more than... So this is key. Because of the Voter Education Project, there were over 650,000 new registrations of people registering to vote. But many people were still refused the right to vote on fairly dubious grounds. So, as you might expect, the white people trying to stop the African Americans from voting just tried to use any trick in the book to stop them from being able to vote. And in fact, in Georgia, which was the place where Albany was, there were churches bombed, ones used by African Americans. Workers were beaten up. Some people were even shot, and all they wanted to do was work. Sometimes it wasn't just the violence. If you rented land or a house from somebody, and the person who you rented from was against African Americans having the vote, you could lose your house, you could lose your job, you could be refused money to borrow. If you want to borrow some money, they might say, no, you're not borrowing money off me, you're registered to vote. And because of all of this violence and this discrimination that continued, well, the people who were taking part in the Voter Education Project thought that the president would protect them they hoped that the president would protect them. And when he didn't do anything, when he set up this project to try to make sure that it happened, so President Kennedy and his brother Robert Kennedy tried to create this, make sure it happened, they didn't actually back them up with force. They didn't force any of these people. They didn't try to protect the people who were trying to vote. And the key group that was involved in the voter education project was the SNCC, which was also the group which organised the sit-ins. There's a lot of acronyms that we're going to get used to, but this one was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, the same ones that had organised the sit-ins. So yeah, the SNCC, and they got all this intimidation, thought they'd be protected, and they weren't protected, so they felt a bit betrayed. So, you know, we had Meredith, where the president steps in, and this, where the president sort of, and the government was willing to set something up, but not really follow it through properly, and got a lot of criticism. But by 1962, so 8 years since it all started, there's been a lot of progress, really, in civil rights compared to the starting point. Black people are more going to school in desegregated, in mixed schools. Black people are managing to break down university barriers. They're stopping places from not serving black people, and so on and so forth. So they've made a chunk of progress up to the point of 1962. You can talk about Montgomery bus boycott, you can talk about James Meredith, you can talk about the sit-ins, Brown versus Topeka, although that was way before 1960 to 62.